Greetings. If this is your first time visiting the channel, then I welcome you. I don't have a name per se, but I am referred to as Zadok, a storyteller. We tend to cover stories of crimes and atrocities on this channel, some committed by people, others committed by monsters, though justice is blind and they are all judged equally in the eyes of the law. If you enjoy the videos I produce, consider subscribing to be notified of future uploads. This story that I have to tell is a particularly gruesome one. The chilling tale of Peter Bryan, London's cannibal killer. Some of the topics discussed in the video are not for the faint of heart. Viewer discretion is advised. On the 17th of February 2004, police were called to a property in Walthamstow where a young woman frantically described her friend being murdered. Police would arrive at the scene to find a man laying on the carpet of his living room, dead in a pool of his own blood. His head was smashed in and his left arm and left leg was severed off in brutal fashion. Next to the man sat Peter Bryan, who calmly told police, "I ate his brain with butter. It was very nice." This, however, wasn't Peter's first killing and would not be his last. What could bring a man to commit such a ghastly crime as eating someone's flesh? The answer may lie in Peter's life experiences growing up. Peter was born on the 4th of October 1969 in London as the youngest child of two immigrants from Barbados. They lived in the suburb of Forest Gate, which at the time was a hub of racial discrimination of the predominantly Afro-Caribbean and South Asian communities, though in recent times has flourished into an accepting neighborhood in the borough of Newham. Peter growing up was thought to be like any other kid. Accounts from his sister have her commenting on how he was a loving brother with a natural talent of bringing out laughter and joy. On one account, she described him as being spoiled rotten by his mother as the favorite child of the house. She thought of him as being laid back and could never imagine him being violent. How wrong she was. Things, however, weren't as rosy as it seemed. Peter's father was very violent to many members of the family, and although he didn't receive much violence his way, Peter was witness to all of this growing up. It likely translated to his poor performance at school, as well as constant disruptive behavior and bullying of other students. Accounts from some of his teachers said that Peter enjoyed the feeling of power over others. He left school with basic qualifications around 15 and began a dark spiral into drug addiction, particularly cannabis. This will be important for later on. His sister noted his manipulative personality at this point, where he would tell people what they wanted to hear if it helped him achieve his goals. He managed to find many oddball jobs to help pay for this dependency over the years, and this was how, in 1993, he came to work at a clothing store as a sales assistant owned by one Mahendra Sheth on the King's Road in Chelsea. This was also when he first met Mahendra's daughter, Nisha Sheth, his first victim. Nisha was a bright girl adored by her parents and siblings. She had finished her schooling with 3 A-levels to her name, and at the time was a fresh-faced 20-year-old student at the South Bank University studying social science. She often helped her family at the store when she had free time. This was how she came into contact with Peter, who, unbeknownst to her, would be the monster that cut her life so tragically short. Nisha was an attractive girl, and in many of the interviews Peter did with authorities, he claimed that there was an intimate relationship between the two of them. He insisted that she thought of them as boyfriend and girlfriend. Her parents strongly denied this claim. However, Peter said that Mahendra would purposefully prevent them from chatting if he ever saw them together. This claim is hard to confirm, as in many South Asian communities, premarital and interracial relationships are shunned even to this day. Peter claims that on many occasions Nisha would rub up on him and show signs of affection, though she would ultimately deny him if he made any moves. This apparently led to a lot of frustration on Peter's part. Peter was not a model employee and soon was fired on the grounds of stealing clothing from the store. A week after the dismissal, on March 18, 1993, Peter would return to the store and embed a crow hammer 6 times into the skull of a helpless Nisha, exposing parts of her brain in the process. She died on the scene. Nisha was apparently on the phone with one of her male friends at the time, which led to a suspicion of this being a crime of passion, perhaps fueled by jealousy and evidenced by the violent nature of the crime, though ultimately this was a result of a psychotic episode of Peter's undiagnosed schizophrenia. Peter then tried to commit suicide by jumping off a bridge, something his close friend, P1, an anonymous name used in the reports, had done a few years prior, though Peter survived. Speaking 8 days after the incident, Nisha's heartbroken mother recalled how Peter was constantly muttering to himself and looking at random spots in the store in the days leading up to the fatal incident. This could possibly indicate his reaction to auditory hallucinations, a hallmark of schizophrenia. She did recall how on his final day as an employee, he gave Nisha a box of flowers, which at the time she thought was heartwarming. Little did she know of the horrific events that would transpire in the week following. Schizophrenia is a disorder of the mind. The cause is not fully understood to this day, though a theory exists that it might be associated with excess dopamine levels in certain neuronal tracts. Patients usually describe first-rank symptoms of delusions, auditory hallucinations, and thought disorder, though some, like Peter Bryan, learn to live with it and appear completely normal. Peter had many risk factors for developing the condition, including his ethnicity, the family history of 2 brothers suffering from the illness, and his excessive use of cannabis. This was ultimately what psychiatrists deemed was affecting his mind at the time of the crime, and Peter was found guilty not of murder, but of manslaughter, with diminished responsibility owing to his mental state. He was referred to Rampton Hospital under Section 37 and 41 for the treatment of his atypical paranoid schizophrenia. During his time at the Rampton, many accounts described him as a model patient, though in many interviews he had a bleak outlook towards his future. He was started on a depot of an antipsychotic medication known as zuclopentixol. Zuclopentixol, or Clopixol as it's more commonly known, is a medication that blocks dopamine receptors and helps alleviate the symptoms of schizophrenia. Usually, however, they are given as tablets. Though for violent patients or those with poor compliance, it can sometimes be given as a long-lasting depot, which is usually an intramuscular injection. This indicates from the beginning that Peter had a lack of insight of his condition and was opposed to medication. This might have contributed to his future killings. Throughout his stay at the Rampton for over 11 years, Peter appeared as a well-behaving and recovering patient. He even wrote a remorseful letter to Mahendra Sheth in 1993 outlining his deep regret and requesting that he might return some of Peter's valuables. Though in 1995, a nurse overheard him saying, "The Peckie had it coming." This further highlighted retrospectively to authorities that Peter was likely a master of manipulation and deceit. Due to his apparent good behavior and progress, he was eventually moved to Riverside House in 2001, a relatively low-security mental health establishment, where he even managed to land a job. He would be allowed to visit friends and family on occasion, though he had constantly been arguing with health professionals to lower and eventually stop his medication, as he felt that he could manage on his own. Eventually they agreed and reduced Bryan's dose. Though, after a disturbing incident of him blowing raspberries on a 16-year-old's stomach, he was transferred to the low-security inpatient Topaz ward at Newham General Hospital. This might have possibly led to the tragic and horrific events that transpired on 17th of February 2004. Bryan Cherry was a friend of Peter. The two had met 2 years prior through a young girl, P8. Cherry was infatuated with this woman and had a perception that they were dating. He would shower her with gifts and money, which the young woman would gladly accept. She had her own drug addictions, and this relationship proved to be a steady source of funding for her. Little did she know that she would become the first witness to one of the UK's most gruesome murders. On that fateful day, on the 17th of February 2004, Peter obtained permission from Topaz Ward to go and visit a friend. He left the premises at 3 p.m. Though instead of going to visit his friend, Mr. Cherry, Peter initially made a detour to a hardware store where he purchased one Stanley knife and a claw hammer. He entered Bryan's flat around 6 p.m. P8, Cherry's girlfriend, had already made plans to meet up with Cherry that evening and called around 6:30 p.m. to confirm. No response. Concerned, she swung by the flat. Everything was eerily silent, but she heard rustling coming from inside the flat. Curious, she opened the door, only to find Peter standing bare-chested. Upon asking where Cherry was, Peter told her to leave. She ignored this and moved further into the house. The living room door was slightly open, and through it she saw a truly terrifying sight. There lay Bryan Cherry, dead. A pool of blood collected under his punctured skull, and his left arm and right leg were cut clean off the torso. P8 calmly retreated out the property and called cops. Peter remained at the property when police arrived and confirmed that he indeed killed Mr. Cherry in a calm tone. As police were investigating the scene, one officer noticed a crackling sound coming from the kitchen. As she moved to take a closer look, Peter said with a smirk, "I ate his brain with butter. It was very nice." Sure enough, sizzling on the pan was a pile of human flesh, later confirmed to be brain tissue. As he was being arrested, he revealed the spine-chilling motive for the barbaric act. He wanted Mr. Cherry's soul, an ancient association with cannibalism. This, however, would not be his last killing. After being deemed fit for police interview, Peter was charged with the murder of Bryan Cherry and sent to Broadmoor High Security Hospital for evaluation and treatment, the killing grounds of his next victim. 59-year-old Richard Loudwell was a fellow inmate at the Broadmoor Hospital and had been admitted there 3 months prior to the arrival of the deceitful monster, Peter Bryan. He had been charged with the sexual assault and murder of 82-year-old Joan Smith, who was found strangled in her flat in Wakeley Road, Raynham, in 2002. His charge, however, was reduced to manslaughter with diminished responsibilities due to Richard's severe mental illness. Owing to his heinous crimes, Richard was constantly bullied both physically and verbally by other patients at the hospital, and this hostility would later prove to aid Peter in his killing. Peter arrived at the facility on the 15th of April 2004, and despite being under high security and isolation initially, he was deemed not to be a threat and allowed to freely move around the premises after just 4 days. Immediately, Peter grew fixated on Richard. In his own words, Peter said, "I've had these urges towards him ever since I saw him. He's at the bottom of the food chain, old, haggard. He looked like he's had his innings." On the 25th of April 2004, an altercation would occur in the dining hall of the establishment. Peter had snuck up behind Richard and attempted to strangle the man with the elastic cord of his trousers, but eventually progressed to smashing his head on the table and floors. Despite there being other patients in the hall at the time, no one intervened, and staff would only learn of the situation once it was too late. Richard was found to be in a bloody state and in a coma that he would never wake from. He succumbed to his injuries a few days later. A nurse who was at the scene of the crime recalled Peter saying that he planned on eating Richard's flesh too, and if he had had sufficient time, he would have made a fine meal of the man. The case gained headlines throughout the UK and much of the world at the time. The heartbreak for the families of Brian Cherry and Richard Loudwell soon turned to anger after it was revealed that Peter would only be charged with manslaughter and diminished responsibility. Though in this case the judge was forced to administer 2 life sentences as per the 2-strike rule for repeat offenders. Though, understandably, the families of the victims were not satisfied. Mr. Cherry's family were notably vocal with the press and demanded the death penalty be reinstated for heinous crimes like Peter's. Mahendra Sheth, on the 12th anniversary of Nisha's death, was also noted to be dissatisfied with the sentencing. To him, the initial treatment of Peter at the Rampton was poor, and anger was directed at the staff for being deceived by the devil and letting a killer walk loose. An appeal was made by Peter's solicitors to reduce the 35 years minimum sentence administered by the judge, but this was quickly denied. The judge claimed Peter would likely never see his freedom for the remainder of his natural life. Here are some of the quotes the judge made at the time. The violence on each occasion was extreme and unpredictable, accompanied by bizarre and sexual overtones. The seriousness of the offenses is exceptionally high, even having a regard to your illness. You had an urge not only to kill, but to eat the flesh of your victim. On the first occasion you did so because for a while you were uninterrupted. You ate his flesh, you fried his brain in his kitchen. In a case such as this, the protection of the public must come before any other consideration. I hope I didn't frighten you too much. The question still remains, was this a severely troubled patient let down by the National Health Service? Or was he a manipulative psychopath that used his illness as an excuse to murder? Leave a comment below with your thoughts and any other stories you'd like me to cover. If you enjoyed the story I shared with you today, leave a like and consider subscribing. And hit the notification bell so you'll know when my next story will be available for you to hear. See you soon, and remember, justice is blind.